Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I'm calling Carmel Cipollone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to join with my parliamentary colleagues from across the House in acknowledging the passing of Celia Lashley. Mr. Speaker, as the mother of 2 sons, I can say that I have been given that book, the book that she wrote, Mr. Speaker, about raising sons. Unfortunately, maybe 16 years too late, but it's good for the 2-year-old that I have. And the 17-year-old, I can say, is okay, despite the fact I didn't get the book too much later. But she was an amazing woman. She's contributed a lot to New Zealand, Mr. Speaker, and I think that that is shown by the number of people today who have stood to acknowledge her before they've launched into their speeches. So, Mr. Speaker, following on from the previous speaker, I just want to point out something that was said. So that was Parmjeet Palmer. One of the comments she made was with respect to people choosing to be on benefits. She said those people who are on benefits by choice. Mr. Speaker, there's just a general attitude from so many people on that side of the House, including the Social Development Minister herself, who recently said that those people on the East Coast are getting a little bit of dole, a little bit of kai moana, and living off their cash crop, and actually have quite a good life, Mr. Speaker. That reflects a general attitude from that side of the House with respect to beneficiaries and those that are experiencing hardship. Mr. Speaker, it's not a healthy attitude. And to say that someone would choose to be on a benefit or that that lifestyle is in some way a desirable lifestyle is incredibly arrogant of that side of the House, because we know living off $200 or $300 a week is not an easy task. And Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of families out there that are living on a minimum amount of money like that, trying to raise children, not by choice, actually, I aim that at the previous speaker, but because of the fact that they can't find work or because of the fact that their family circumstances don't allow them to go and work. So perhaps that previous National Party speaker needs to rethink some of the lines she reads out from their research centre before standing up in the House and sharing them with the rest of the country. Mr. Speaker, I say that, but actually, going back to the bill, it is one of those bills that actually we agree with the National Party on. We do support this bill, Mr. Speaker, just not the general attitude towards beneficiaries and towards New Zealanders experiencing hardship. But we do support the bill, Mr. Speaker. We support this bill as it makes some minor but sensible changes to remove loopholes in the Social Security Act. And this bill will ensure that those receiving ACC payments from their employer are treated the same as those receiving ACC payments from ACC itself. Labor supports that equal treatment, so we do support this bill. As the law stands, those people receiving an ACC payment from their employer could also challenge WINS to provide them with a full benefit payment. What we do wonder on this side of the House is how many, if any times, this has occurred in the 4 years this bill has languished on the order paper. Similarly, how much extra has been paid out in accommodation supplements to students over the last 4 years as a result of the loophole this bill intends to close. Now, I point out the 4-year period, Mr. Speaker, because as has been mentioned by several of our colleagues today, this bill was actually introduced to the House in November 2010. Now, looking at the national government, you know, how many times during the last 6 years, 7 years that they've been in power, have we heard them talking about the need to have a tighter welfare system, to look for ways in which to cut costs across our public sector with respect to all public spending. And yet here we have loopholes which would have cost the country money in some way, but it's been allowed to continue for the last 4 years, despite the fact that the national government knew that this was happening and despite the fact that this bill was introduced to the House in 2010. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to point out the fact that despite that government's rhetoric around wanting to save the taxpayer money, wanting to cut costs and protect public spending and everything else, there are so many instances like this one where they've allowed things to continue for 4 years in this instance, which has actually cost the taxpayer money. So, going back to the bill, we do support the bill. We're disappointed that it's been allowed to languish for the last 4 years, but we do support the bill. Mr Speaker, this may be a small bill, but the fact that such easily fixed loopholes have been left unattended for so long does show the ineptitude of this government. It is a government that, Mr Speaker, has lost its way, caught up in MP scandals and casino deals gone wrong instead of doing the basic job of governing. And Mr Bridges said that they are a government that takes their time. Well, unfortunately, they take too much time with things that matter and try and speed through on things that actually New Zealanders are concerned about, that should actually have some time spent on them.
That's right.
Mr Speaker, as submitters alluded to in the Select Committee sessions, it is a government that has lost its way. It was the submitters that alluded to that. On support for students and tertiary education, Mr Speaker, this bill closes a loophole that allows students to claim the WINS accommodation supplement instead of the student allowance in instances where it is more generous. But frankly, who can blame students for looking for a little extra wherever they can, as this government has put the squeeze on this already low-income group over the past 6 years? And there's a few instances that I can point out where the squeeze has been put on students in this country, students who some of the national MPs have been celebrating the successes of, but at the same time have actually made it a lot harder for them to be able to achieve those successes over the last 6 years that National have been in government. Mr Speaker, first example of where the national government have made it difficult for these students has been where student allowance rates have barely increased while the price of rental accommodation has skyrocketed. And we really see that in places like Auckland, where the student allowance is almost exactly the same as what it was 6 or 7 years ago, but rentals have just gone through the roof. And Mr Speaker, how can these students possibly be expected to pay their rent, to pay all of their expenses when their actual allowance is not increased at all? Another example, Mr Speaker, students have seen course fees increase by up to 5% every year, and they've had to absorb that hike, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, student loans have been cut for part-time students. We've seen student loan repayment rates have been increased by 20%. A new $40 annual student fee has been tacked on, and Stephen Joyce has professed his desire as tertiary education to dampen demand for university. So actually they want to put people off going to university. Mr Speaker, that's a dismal and short-sighted view for the future and symptomatic of a government that has lost its way, and that's what the submitters pointed out when they came through the Select Committee. Now, I just want to add another couple of examples where that government has not been supportive of students to be able to achieve the successes that they wanted to talk about celebrating earlier, and that's with respect to students over 55 who have been denied access to living costs or course-related costs. And to be quite frank, Mr Speaker, I actually think that is discrimination. It's discrimination based on age. They're saying there that actually once you get to a certain age, you don't deserve to learn, you have no further contribution to be able to make to the society. And it's actually quite sad because before Labor left office, there was a focus, a general focus around the importance of adult learning, lifetime learning, but once National took office, that was gone. Mr Speaker, another example of where they have shown themselves to be unsupportive of students is with respect to the time limits they've now placed on how long you can access student allowances for. And I want to point that out because the ones that are really affected by that actually are your students that come from low-income families. They're the ones that actually can't afford to pay for their living costs and everything else. Perhaps they want to go on to postgraduate studies after they finish those undergraduate degrees, but because of the time limits that government has put on, they're no longer given the opportunity to do so. And I've heard national MPs point out the fact, well, they can go and get scholarships, they can go and get all these other things. Well, actually, they're not, as scholarships and access to funding outside of the state is not as available as what some of those national MPs might think. So, Mr Speaker, we do support this bill, but I wanted to take the opportunity to point out that it has not been easy being a student under the national government over the last 6 or 7 years. And here they are at the moment closing a loophole, but what we'd really like to see, and I'm sure students across New Zealand who are aspirational and trying to get to a better place, I'm sure those students would like to see the national government actually demonstrate that they are not only supportive of those students once they reach that aspirational level, but they're actually supportive of those students along the journey to becoming successful. That's what that national government has not shown today. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Jonah Naylor.